There is a serious tension in the world between those people who like GM and those people who don't like GM, and it has been argued that genetic modification is counterproductive to production in the third worlds. They simply can't afford it, that they can't afford the herbicides you would actually need to increase production, they can't afford the pesticides and so on. If you look at traditional agriculture, let's say they can actually produce 4 tonnes per hectare and you get 25% of losses post-harvest, so you end up with 3 tonnes to eat. If you can engineer these tropical species with pest resistance plus some post-harvest qualities, for example by putting in Bacillus thuringiensis crystal toxin gene, maybe put in a protease inhibitor to provide improved post-harvest qualities, you might only get 10% loss, plus improved production because you're not so badly affected by things like locusts. And by fairly simple means you should be able to dramatically improve the amount of crop which is available for people to eat. So I don't actually see any tension between production in the third world and genetic modification. There are plenty of labs that have been set up in Africa producing GM crops for use locally and throughout the rest of Africa. And the reason that the technology is not actually being used has got nothing to do with the fact that it doesn't work in Africa, or that the seed cannot be produced and distributed. It's the fact that they cannot then subsequently sell their crops. There's been a backlash against GM crops, wholly irrational backlash against GM foods in the Western world. Oh, we want to know what we're eating. We're introducing genes from another species. We're going to die if we eat it. And this has led companies like Iceland, which is a sort of big provider of frozen foods in the UK, to say that they're going to have a non-GM policy. They will not buy GM foods. So African farmers, they can produce crops in abundance through improved qualities through GM crops. They cannot then subsequently sell their crops. In Kenya, a couple of years ago, they had a disastrous harvest, and they brought in a whole load of maize from the Western world in order to stop their people dying of starvation. And the president of the country found out that some of this maize was GM maize and refused to let it be distributed to his starving people. He would rather his people died of natural means than eat GM maize. It's a sad, sad world that we live in. This is a picture of Lake Victoria, and you can see in yellow this is the region which is infected with cassava mosaic virus. Now, the region around Lake Victoria is a big cassava growing region, and we've had a huge extension in the region which is affected by cassava mosaic virus. But it is possible to engineer resistance to cassava mosaic virus into cassava using coat protein genes and produce a high level of resistance. So this technology could be implemented in Africa immediately, provided that the political willing was there. One of the perceived benefits of GM crops is to reduce the amount of energy which is actually needed to grow GM crops. So if you put pest resistance into crops, you don't have to spread pesticides, insecticides onto your crop, and this saves energy, firstly in actually producing the insecticide in the first place, in transporting it to your particular region, and then actually spraying it on your fields. So basically you can actually save energy by using GM crops. There are a whole load of approved traits in GM crops. So glufosinate resistance, cethoxidin herbicide resistance, bromoxynil, glyphosate, sulfonylurea herbicides, male sterility, modified fatty acids, flower colour, flower life, delayed fruit ripening, virus resistance. The big one down there, BT, Bacillus thuringiensis, crystal toxin. And all this has happened over a relatively short time span. If you look at traditional agriculture, from the original hunter-gatherers to the introduction of the agricultural revolution, whether we introduce crop rotations, we're talking about thousands of years. From the agricultural revolution in the Middle Ages to the Green Revolution in the 1950s, we're talking about a few hundred years. For development of GM foods, we're talking about decades. It was the 1950s when we had the first regeneration of entire plants from an in vitro culture. The 1970s before we were able to isolate genes. And the 1980s before we produced the first transgenic plant, which is antibiotic resistant tobacco. And to put this into perspective, I actually finished my PhD before they'd actually engineered the first transgenic plant. In 1985, they'd introduced useful traits, so insect resistance, virus resistance, bacterial resistance, and field tested them for the first time. 1990, in China, we had the first successful field trial of a GM crop, GM cotton. In 1994, we had the first FDA approved food, the Flavour Saver tomato. And this was produced by Genentech largely as a trial. They wanted to find out how acceptable would genetically modified foods be to the general public. So rather than putting a lot of effort and expense into producing, for example, herbicide resistance corn, they actually went for the tomato. It's relatively easy to regenerate tomatoes. And 1995, Monsanto's Roundup Ready soybeans were approved for sale in the United States. And since then have taken over a huge proportion of the world's production. And they've done this because they have very large benefits over non-GM soybean.